You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? Hello, and welcome back to Romancing in Paris. I hope you liked the last episode of the podcast, which took us outside Paris to explore the most romantic aspects of the Château de Versailles, and with a focus on Marie Antoinette. If you missed it, I suggest you go back to take a listen, as it features some wonderful insight from special guest and Marie Antoinette expert, Dr. Susan Taylor-Leduc. Before that episode, we'd wrapped up our second tour of the left bank districts, which takes us today back across the Seine and to the 16th district. As much as the 16th can be a bit quiet, its posh residents snug in their opulent apartments and mansions, this large, lesser-visited district of the city actually has a number of romantic spots. Always seeking to change things up a little bit in regards to the types of venues discussed, in today's episode, we go to a very special theater. One of the most romantic in the whole city. Romantic in appearance, but also in its origins. Grab your chérie and your show program. We're going to the Théâtre de Ranelagh. If you've ever taken Metro Line 9 deep into the 16th, you've likely passed Ranelagh Station with a very un-French spelling of the word, Ranelagh. Although the metro shares the name of the street above and the theater we're going to be covering, the area used to have a completely different name. The surrounding land, which is roughly across the river from the Eiffel Tower and a little to the west, used to contain the castle and estate of Boulainvilliers. It wasn't just any regular chateau. It was one created out of love. Oh yes. In 1722, banker Samuel Bernard bought the 8-hectare estate in Château from the Lord of Passy, with the purpose of building a castle here for his mistress, Madame de Fontaine. Spread over a hill north of the Seine, the Passy Castle had roots dating all the way back to the late 1300s, and still to this day the area is called Passy, linked back to this estate. Not a bad setting at all for a Chateau d'Amour, a love castle. When Samuel Bernard died in 1739, he bequeathed the chateau to Madame de Fontaine, who then sold it to Bernard's son, Gabriel Bernard de Rieux. I guess she wasn't all that fond of it, or perhaps it had too many links to her chérie. Gabriel lived in the chateau until his own death in 1745, at which time it passed down to his son, Anne Gabrielle de Boulainvilliers, giving thus a new name to the castle. If you know the 16th, Boulainvilliers might ring a bell, as there's also a Boulainvilliers Street and RER station. Anne Gabrielle rented out the castle to tax farmer Alexandre Joseph de la Pouplinière, a great fan of music and patron of musicians. He not only let top musicians of the era stay at this regal home, he also hosted other prestigious creative guests, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and artist Charles-André Van Loo, who painted some of the romantic paintings in the Hôtel de Sully, which we talked about in episode 3 of the podcast. Another great one I suggest you go back and listen to. Since he didn't own the castle, La Pouplinière couldn't really make any changes to the building itself. However, he obtained permission to add a music room, or rather, a small theatre. He sponsored an orchestra for the theatre, and even took to writing some plays himself, which were put on there. After these performances, attendees were treated to a sumptuous banquet. Another reason his private theatre became quite popular, attracting nobles, foreign ambassadors, and, so it's said, the most beautiful women in Paris. Oh la la! When he died in 1762, the castle's new resident was Louis Jean-Marie de Bourbon, the Duke de Penthièvre. The poor Duke was in mourning over the death of his wife and 4 of their children. So sadly, the joyful life of the castle was quieted, and its theatre went into an extended intermission. The Duke died in 1793, but since the Revolution was in full swing, the castle remained abandoned for a few more decades, until it was sold in 1825 to a real estate development company. It divvied up the estate and started driving several streets through it. These include some which still exist today, like the Rue de Ranelagh, Rue de Boulainvilliers, and the Rue des Marronniers. These formed a hamlet which was called Boulainvilliers, and it was still outside the borders of Paris. However, the development was unstoppable, and in 1860, Paris's urban sprawl officially gobbled up the village of Boulainvilliers and its surroundings when the area was annexed into the city, much like other villages such as Montmartre. A few decades later, in 1890, industrialist Louise Moore and his wife Alice bought several of the plots of land which were available, in the aim of building a large private mansion. Having made his fortune in electrical railway signaling material, Louise Moore and his brother decided to get into the new transportation craze, the automobile. The company Voiture Moore became a serious rival to Renault and did especially well in the popular sport of car racing. But voitures weren't the only things Moore was interested in. He shared La Pouplinière's love of music. He created a musicology department at the Collège de France and had an impressive collection of musical instruments. This is what led him to build a new music hall in 1894, virtually on the same spot as La Pouplinière's former theatre, and equally mirroring the history of the previous theatre. His, too, was private, and above the door he had the following words inscribed: Pour moi et pour mes amis, for me and my friends. For the interiors, he hired Alban Chambon, who designed numerous theatres, restaurants, and hotels around Europe. Chambon richly decorated the 300-seat venue with ornate sculpture and molding work, Here he chose a neo-Flemish Renaissance style. Due to being in the business of electrical material, it's not surprising that Moore's Theatre was one of the first in Paris to be equipped with the latest technology, that of electric lighting. During Moore's ownership, the theatre also had some notable performances, like the first presentation in France of the orchestral version of Wagner's Das Rheingold, the first of his 4 musical dramas of the Ring of the Nibelung series, which was put on here in 1900. A few years later, in 1908, he put on Bizet's L'Arlésienne, and all the profits went to charity. Another notable event was in 1913 when he had Debussy himself come to perform Syrinx. Louise Moore died in 1917, and in 1925 his widow sold the estate, and the building was sadly demolished to make way for larger buildings. That is, the whole complex save for the theatre. In 1931, in keeping with the era's changes in entertainment, the theatre was turned into an art house cinema, which was rather influential and became a favorite cinema of Marcel Carné, the famous French filmmaker, who directed Les Enfants du Paradis, The Children of Paradise, a cult film which was screened frequently here. Over the rest of the 20th century, the theatre also put on concerts and plays, which is once again what its primary use is today. If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, which interviews a writer with links to Paris, who then reads an excerpt of their writing. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors.
And now, back to Romancing in Paris.
I think it's about time we stop by for a visit. Don't you agree? Now, to truly experience the theatre, you'd need to attend a show here. Hopefully this podcast will tempt you to do so. The good news is the theatre puts on a wonderful range of plays and of exceptional quality. Of these, there is often one within the programme of Theatre in Paris, which makes French theatre accessible to those not fluent in French thanks to sub or surtitles put on during the performance in English. So, if your French isn't complètement parfait, you can still come to the theatre, and it's a great way to watch authentic French theatre productions and to understand them. Although you can reach the theatre from RERC, Avenue du Président Kennedy and Boulainvilliers, this will take you out at the Radio France building. Although it's linked to music, it's a rather unattractive modern building and hardly romantic. Instead, I suggest you take Metro Line 9 and get off at La Muette or Ranelagh Station, which is more picturesque as well as being linked to the area's history, as I described earlier. Arriving at number 12 Rue des Vignes, you might be wondering why this theatre is special, as it doesn't look like much from there. The theatre is actually sitting in between this street and the Rue des Marronniers. Once inside, you will see its romantic appeal. If you arrive early, you can go around the corner to Rue des Marronniers, where, at number 2, you can see a plaque in reference to the castle which once stood here. As I mentioned earlier, its designer created interiors in the neo-Flemish Renaissance style. These included detailed molding and beautifully carved oak ceilings and statues. plus bronze sculptures on the pillars. Chambon had most of the moulding and carving work for the theatre done in his workshops in Brussels, which substantially reduced the costs. This beautiful work of architecture and theatrical arts has been a national monument since 1977. Another interesting detail is that the room is in the form of a théâtre à la française. That is, rectangular in shape and with all the seats facing the stage, which differs from the horseshoe shape around the stage, which is considered a théâtre à l'italienne and is the case with most other Parisian theatres. So take note of this when you're seated. Speaking of which, the red seats and the red velour drapery also add to its romantic ambiance. The theatre has a bar, so if you come early, you can enjoy a pre-show drink here, which helps create a magnifique romantic outing for you and your chérie in the 16th district. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Romancing in Paris. If you're new to the podcast, you might like to take a listen back through previous episodes, as I've hinted to in this one, as they include a wide range of fabulous romantic places in Paris. You can also peruse my website Je t'aime neither, which features other great articles on unique romantic things to do in Paris and beyond. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.